It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Our guest today is Russ Baker, and he runs a website, a news website called whowhatwhy.org. Very well respected, very well known. In fact, the motto is controversial, credible, and courageous. He's written a book called Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Russ Baker, are you there?
I am. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. So tell us about yourself. Who is Russ Baker?
Well, I am a guy with a lot of questions. And I started asking them as a young child and probably drove my parents crazy. I remember, I think my first one was, are there toys in dye? I was concerned about whether there would be toys in heaven. But I moved on from there and now ask mostly questions about the human condition on Earth and about, I like to question everything. I started Who, What, Why, which is a nonprofit organization, because I felt that we could not rely on large news organizations with the various pressures that they face as for-profit institutions and as very much parts of the establishment to really dig deep into things that make us fundamentally uncomfortable. And so I started Who, What, Why with that in mind after many, many years of being a journalist, both on staff and freelance, and had the opportunity to write for and do some TV and radio for some of the largest news brands in the United States and around the world. Traveled widely and covered things such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the overthrow of the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, the Hutu Tutsi massacres in Central Africa, the Zapatista uprising in Mexico, the depredations of large foreign companies in the rainforests of Indonesia, and on and on. But my main specialty, I would say, is power, and particularly power in America, power in Washington, who has it, what they're doing with it, and I'm particularly interested in constellations of power that we little understand. When I started Who, What, Why, the idea was to create an entity where you could ask questions that other news organizations were not asking, and do it without being attacked, or do it despite attacks. And what I mean by that is there is absolutely conformity in media, and you see it. All you have to do, I remember as a kid, I would see my father changing the channels, ABC, NBC, CBS, and then I noticed that they all had the same story. So I said, are those the only stories that there are? And of course he laughed. And, there's a tremendous amount of kind of keeping an eye on what everybody else is doing. And the idea is you play it safe. Once there's a consensus on anything, that's where you go. But then what you do is you try to scoop everybody else. You try to be going in the same exact direction, but be a little bit out ahead. You've got this slice of it. You got that slice of it. That's different. It's very, very risky to a career to introduce a contrary concept. And of course we now have all these terms like fake news, the widely used and I think inappropriately used term conspiracy theorists, which lumps together everybody from those who are on one hand either lazy or insane, on the other hand people who actually are trying to understand sub rosa elements that influence the shaping of policy and wars and so forth. And so I was very interested in the latter. That led me to begin my work on the book that became Family of Secrets. And the background there is that in 2003, I was writing about the what looked like was going to be certain war with Iraq, and I was warning that there was going to be no basis for this. The vast majority of the media were all supporting the war, and then, of course, they all scrambled to decry it later on, which is very, very common media tactics. But the following year, there you had George W. Bush, despite the fact that he had lied America into this war, generating incredible tragedy on many, many different levels. There he was running for re-election. Of course, I was astonished by that. And I also, when I saw that there was a Vietnam vet, war hero who was anti-war running against Bush, who had not served fully during the Vietnam War, who was running as pro-war, I said, well, this is such an interesting thing. I started working on it, and what I found was, as I discovered things about Bush, I would be told by the various magazines that were employing me that, well, people just have such a low expectation for him that almost anything you come up with, nobody will care. And I think that's so important, Ed, because it's a precursor to what we have with Donald Trump. When the bar it gets lowered so much, and we get in this kind of nihilistic space where everybody says, well, yeah, but what do you expect? There are no standards for anything anymore, and we simply can't function as a society, and certainly journalism can't function. So I thought, well, what the heck? I'm going to start my own news organization that's not going to dance to the tune everybody else does, and we're going to do our own thing. That was Who, What, Why. That was the book Family of Secrets, which was a deep dive into the back history of the Bush family. Basically, Ed, as I investigated Bush and his military service, I discovered that, in fact, he had skipped out on Vietnam, which is that's a serious crime. And he had gotten away with it. And the more I dug into it, it became clear that his father, who was a very powerful man, wasn't vice president or president yet, or CIA director, but was very, very well connected. I saw that the father seemed to have played a role in covering up for the son, and I thought, well, I want to learn a little more about this family and the father. And I was fascinated that the son, who really was, people were pretty shocked that somebody with such poor credentials could become president of the United States. I think with Trump, we're no longer surprised by anything. But back then, we were surprised that this fellow, who was really so unaccomplished and so undistinguished in almost every way, could become president. And then I thought, well, how did he become president? I said, well, people would say, well, that was because his father was president, and they had the same name, and people like Dynasty. So I said, well, let's look at the father then. How did the father become president? And they said, well, he was vice president. So I said, well, why was he vice president? They said, well, he was CIA director. And then I said, well, why was he CIA director? And then they just kind of stared at me because they had no idea why he was CIA director. And I began looking at why Bush Sr. was made the head of the CIA, because from what I could tell, he had no qualifications for that. In fact, he had no expertise or experience or knowledge of any kind relating to anything relating to intelligence, purportedly. But this is the key word, Ed, purportedly, because as I dug into the father, I discovered that, lo and behold, he actually was qualified for the job because he had managed to get elected vice president and president without the public ever learning that he had essentially a secret life. And that secret life was that he had presented himself as being an oil man, but that those activities, I discovered as I dug in, were non-official cover for his work in the Central Intelligence Agency long, long before he was CIA director, long before he was a congressman or a UN ambassador or an envoy to China, that he was, starting out as a young man, he was brought into the intelligence service, and he was using these companies as cover, and he was involved with all manner of fascinating activities. And, of course, this is the basis for what began a 5-year journey for me to produce Family of Secrets. And I might say that when the book came out, people were so excited by it because it was so much work involved. I think I interviewed over 1,000 people, and there were well more than 1,000 footnotes, certainly. And there was just tons and tons of new stuff about two presidents of the United States, and yet everybody got excited, all the big TV stations, and everybody wanted to have me on. And then just before I was to go on, one after another, they began canceling. And it was almost like a horror movie or something like that, with the scary music, and you go like, what the heck is going on here? And I think even my publisher, I mean, they had published Harry Potter, for God's sake. They were stunned by this. They couldn't believe it. They were sure this thing was going to be a giant, mega bestseller, and I just got the total silent treatment, and it became very, very clear that certain people talked to other certain people and convinced them it's not worth their while to have me on, not to give the exposure at all to this type of thing. And I think that explains, in many respects, why in this country we don't really get the truth, because the truth, if it's unacceptable to powerful people, they have ways of preventing it coming out. And that really is a motivating factor for me in my daily work with Who or Why, to make sure that those people cannot stop the truth from coming out.
Yeah, I've even seen recently where even after a story is out and then there's an NDA settlement in the background, the old story that was up on a major publication is then removed. Okay? And I just witnessed this with my own eyes just recently. Now, did you check into Prescott Bush and his history?
I did. In fact, I went back 7 or 8 or 9 generations. There was even stuff I ended up not putting in there, like I traced the Bush family all the way back to one guy who was made to walk the plank by pirates, and another person who was burned at the stake as a witch, as I recall. But I didn't even put that in the book just because I had so much more recent stuff I had to focus on. I did a lot on Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush was a very powerful figure, not as well known today except in certain circles as he probably should be. He was really one of the princes of the American aristocracy, and he came from a family that was extremely ambitious and already reasonably well connected on a certain level. His own father had been the head of small arms procurement for the U.S. in World War I. Through connections, and then Prescott married well, as they say, went to Yale and got into the secret society Skull and Bones, and he made friends with a couple of guys whose family name was Harriman. Their father ran some of the largest railroads in America, among other things, as well as being a big player in finance and so forth, and so he got to know them. He married the daughter of a guy named George Herbert Walker, who again should be much better known than he is. He was one of the most important investment bankers in the United States, and even back in the early part of the 20th century, you see him traveling all over the world making deals. And this man then, Prescott Bush introduced him to the Harrimans when their father died at a fairly young age, and they were right out of college and were supposed to run this empire. And so George Herbert Walker was brought in to run it, and so that eventually evolved where they merged with a banking concern called Brown Brothers, and they became what is today known as Brown Brothers Harriman. And you can still go down to Wall Street and see this sort of very elite banking institution that is not well known, but has had a hand in so many steering events throughout history. In fact, if you go back and you can pull a copy of The Nation magazine, I think from 1922 or something, and you see a cover story called the Republic of Brown Brothers, and it's about U.S. invasions in other countries like Nicaragua, where the U.S. is invading on behalf of large American corporations to overthrow any sort of leader that the corporations did not like. And so what I saw was with Prescott Bush, and then with his son, George H.W., nicknamed Poppy Bush, and George W. Bush, and so on, the whole family were really kind of foot soldiers for even wealthier people and interests and corporations, that they felt that they were they knew what was good for themselves and also what was good for everybody else, and the purpose to them of government was basically to secure their interests.
Well, did you ever look into that strange story about Pierce, Barbara Bush's mother, and her relationship with Aleister Crowley?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that Barbara's mother was... she was a sort of a free spirit. She was a fashion model. Her father, Barbara's grandfather, was an executive with women's magazines, kind of a typical, lived in a typical wealthy suburb north of New York City. But Barbara's mother was sort of a free spirit, and she, as I said, was a model and traveled around the world. At one point, she apparently went and lived in Paris, where she got to know Aleister Crowley, Crowley. Folks can look him up, famous for his interests in the black arts, shall we say, and Satanism and so forth. And supposedly she kind of fell into that circle in Paris. And of course, there's a rumor, and I can't address it. I have really no opinion on it, but it is interesting that Barbara was conceived. If you sort of do the math on it, looks like it may have been at a time when her mother was in Paris in that circle. And so I will leave it to people's imagination. But in any case, one thing that's certainly true is Barbara did not look that much like her sister. And of course, you may remember when she was First Lady and so on, there were always remarks about her looks. But of course, her mother, being a fashion model,
right,
and then her sister, who also, I believe, was a model, that Barbara really was sort of the ugly duckling of the family. And I have to admit, I have not taken pictures of Crowley to sort of try to match up and see if we see any of the physiognomy there. But that is a story that's certainly been around.
Well, one thing the audience should know is that one of Crowley's practices was chaos sex magic. It was very into sexual behavior. And there's a picture out there, guys. Okay, I'm not advocating anything, but there is a picture out there of the young Bush sons, the 4 sons, and they're the young, the college age, and they look very much like a young Crowley. We don't need to dwell on that. Wait, what about the other? There's 4 Bush sons besides W. Bush. What are the other ones up to?
Well, first of all, there's Jeb, who was ordained to be the 3rd Bush in office. Can you imagine that? 3 people from the same family, topping the Adams, John Adams family, and so there were going to be 3, and that was the case until Donald Trump came along, really, and just destroyed Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush was, of course, a governor of Florida. He and George were very competitive, and they were both running at the same time the first time around, and then George won, and Jeb lost, and then Jeb ran again. Parents were disappointed because Jebby was really kind of, in a way, sort of their favorite, I think, and probably more diligent, shall we say, in just buckling down and getting to whatever the work was that he was doing, whereas his older brother was a goof off, always was, and was also as president, of course, with his long exercise sessions in the middle of the day and knocking off work so early and all of that kind of stuff. But anyway, that was Jeb, and then we have Neil, and Neil was every presidential family seems to have at least one son who tries to make some money off of the family name, utilize connections, whether it was Beau Biden or Jimmy Carter's brother with his Billy Beer, or Roger Clinton. And so Neil was the one trying to do that. He moved to Colorado. He got into the oil and gas business, mostly getting deals with people who wanted to have connections to the White House. And he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. One of the interesting stories with him was that when his father ran for president, was extremely ambitious, Poppy Bush, and really was very eager from a young age to be president, and they kept trying different things to get him there. First, and this is in my book, Family of Secrets, there's a section about how 1968, when he had just been a freshman congressman, his father and the family and their connections were already trying to force Richard Nixon to put him on the ticket as vice president, and Nixon didn't want to do it. And later on we can talk a little bit about Nixon and the Bushes and the Kennedy assassination, and reasons that Nixon didn't want to have a vice president who was very ambitious. He was afraid it was a threat to his own safety. And so he didn't take Bush. He gave him another job over at the UN because he felt he was obligated. And again, we could talk about that. Why was Nixon obligated to put a Bush somewhere in a prominent position? But in any case, he then, the father in 1968, as I say, wanted to be vice president. And then he began sort of plotting his way to run for president, wanted to run in 1976, and they gave him this ambassadorship to China, supposedly with the agreement that he would not oppose Ford. And then in 1980, he finally ran, and he ran against Reagan, and Reagan beat him. And but then, surprisingly, even though there was so much animosity, Reagan not only took him as the vice president, but agreed to take Bush's close friend and campaign manager, James Baker, as Reagan's campaign manager. And I thought that was so strange because here's Reagan, ran a great campaign and won, and takes Bush's guy, the guy who lost, takes his guy to run his campaign. Anyway, they win. Bush becomes vice president. Now he's looking at another 8 years. This extremely ambitious guy's looking at another 8 years. And then, about 2 months after they're inaugurated, Ronald Reagan is shot, and he's shot by a guy named John Hinckley. Now, John Hinckley comes from a family also in the oil and gas business, also came from Midland, Texas, the sort of dusty West Texas oil town where Poppy Bush had gone as a young man, quote-unquote, to make his fortune with the support and connections of the family companies that worked in the oil business. And so so they knew the Hinkleys quite well, I mean, extremely well, even shared a lawyer in common. And so it was very interesting, and the media barely mentioned this. This was the first sign that we had problems with the media. They barely mentioned that the man who shot Ronald Reagan was the son of close friends of the vice president.
Didn't they even have a dinner scheduled that night?
They had a dinner scheduled that night. Neil Bush was supposed to have dinner with John Hinckley's brother. Now, whatever you make of that, and I realize a lot of this could be coincidence. I'm quite sure it seems unlikely Neil Bush would schedule a dinner with the brother of somebody who was about to shoot his father's boss. But it is interesting, and obviously those things merit some scrutiny and merit some investigation. And, of course, it's so weird. People say, well, it's so weird, let's just not even deal with it. But, I remember, I think it was Peter Jennings led with that item and mentioned that they knew the Bush family. And do you know that thing, when they reran the news, they took it off? And there was so much pressure. I think I want to say UPI, I believe it was, the wire service, had a story, and then it was removed about this connection. In other words, they were able to just, the same thing they did to me, to suppress Family of Secrets, so that probably most of your listeners may not even have heard of it, when everybody should have heard of it, the book, because it was a significant book, investigative book about two presidents of the United States. The same thing happened with the Bush-Hinckley connection. And so this was, of course, amazing to me. I ended up not even putting it in my book because my publisher said, well, your book is so explosive already. You have so much hot stuff in here. You add that, it's going to be way too much. It's kind of like a car that it's going to overheat. So that was the decision they made. I did write about it on our website, whowhatwhy.org, some years later.
Let's back up a second, too, back to Prescott Bush. Wasn't he involved in a coup attempt or treason? He was charged with treason or something? Assets were seized?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. There was an attempt to foment a military coup against Franklin Roosevelt. And again, listeners, if you're unfamiliar with this, this tells you something about the state of knowledge in this country. You have to kind of listen to shows like this. Congratulations to you, Ed, for doing a show that's willing to talk about these things, and I hope people listen and support you. But, people don't know about the history of their own country. They don't know what's really going on because we're not allowed to talk about it. And so these kinds of things absolutely do not get covered. And, even back in the early 30s, when Franklin Roosevelt was seen by key elements on Wall Street, key corporations, as a threat to their interests in the recovery from the Great Depression, and he was trying to correct the banking system and the depredations of capital that had gotten us into this mess, they were so worried about him. that they made an effort to convince a storied World War I Marine General, Smedley Butler, to lead this uprising. I mean, people might be astonished to hear that, but yes, that could happen in this country too. And of course, John F. Kennedy always worried that there would be a coup against him. And we can talk about that if you like, since about 5 chapters of my book, Family of Secrets, are new information on the John F. Kennedy assassination and what that was really about. But in any case, you don't hear about any of this stuff. And there are people who shake their heads and they say, oh, well, this is ridiculous, this is crazy. And those are people who are often well-educated, but they're part of the establishment, and they know very, very little. All of their information comes from a handful of major, aesthetically attractive news media brands that are very prestigious. They come from reading books that are on approved bestseller lists and that type of thing. They go to dinner parties back in the days when you were able to go out to dinner parties with other people who also watched and listened to the same things, and they're in a bubble and they don't know about this. But yes, there was this coup attempt, and there was a congressional inquiry into this, the McCormick. I can't remember what's called, something McCormick Committee, and they investigated this, and they confirmed that in fact there had been this coup attempt. General Butler actually testified. I mean, the reason the coup was revealed was because he was uncomfortable with it, and he went public with it. But there were no repercussions. I mean, think about how incredible that is. That top people associated with major banks, major corporations like DuPont were implicated, and nobody went to jail. And the only thing I could tell about Prescott Bush is he was very much part of that circle, that Wall Street circle. I personally have not seen any paperwork directly connecting him to the plot. And I want to say, to me, good journalism is not wishful thinking. It's all factual, and it's all based on credible documentation and testimony and so forth. And so I'm very, very careful in what I do and what I don't assert, and I believe that that's why my own work, Family of Secrets, and the work we do at Who, What, Why is taken seriously by all kinds of people because they know how careful we are.
Yeah, it's whowhatwhy.org, and it's a good time to take a commercial break. We're talking to Russ Baker, slamming us with some great knowledge here. Russ, I'm really enjoying this. Thank you so much. So, Russ, you were saying that a large portion of the book covers the JFK assassination?
Yeah, it might seem strange. You might say, well, why in the world would he have the JFK assassination in a book about the Bush family? The answer is that this just kind of came up in my research. And as I was saying earlier, when I discovered that George H.W. Bush had a secret life working for the CIA undercover for decades, before he was named CIA director, I was interested that he was named CIA director at precisely the time when really the only moment in this country's history when there was this very serious, what wasn't the only moment, it was the first moment when there was a very serious investigation of the Kennedy assassination challenging the conclusions of the Warren Commission. Mid-'70s, you had a bunch of different Senate and House committee investigations, and then eventually you had the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which, unlike the Warren report, concluded the likelihood that there was some sort of a conspiracy, that either Oswald didn't do it or didn't act alone. And so the CIA was under extreme pressure because all sorts of things were coming out, including the so-called family jewels, which were revealing CIA secrets, including the fact that the agency was basically out of control and was running all kinds of things that had never been authorized by our elected representatives, including removal and sometimes assassination of democratically elected leaders abroad. And so the CIA was under tremendous, tremendous scrutiny and pressure. And right at that moment, they appointed, of all people, George H.W. Bush, nicknamed Poppy Bush, to run the agency. And it was pretty clear when you started to look at it that he was brought in to oversee the cover-up, and he didn't really seem to be such a skilled guy, so the thought was that at least he was a trusted person, that he was trusted to oversee this period where they were hiding the goods. And so I was already interested in him, and as I began investigating him for what would become my book, Family of Secrets, I then started going back with a fine-tooth comb over his whole history and discovered that, this had been published by the author Kitty Kelly, that he had once been asked, where was he on November 22, 1963? What did he remember about that day? And he certainly was a Texan, and he was a candidate for the United States Senate in 1963, traveling around the state giving speeches. He claimed in this interview, according to the interviewers, that he couldn't remember where he was on the day that Kennedy was shot, or when he heard that Kennedy was shot. And of course that struck many, many people, not just me, as extremely odd. So I thought, well, why don't I just find out where he was? And that began years of research. And I discovered, and this is all in Family of Secrets, 5 chapters of new information on the Kennedy assassination, around the question, what did George H.W. Bush know or not know, and why did he, if he was couldn't remember where he was that day, and we know that he was doing work for the CIA at that time undercover, what was that all about? And in a nutshell, I discovered that he was in Dallas that day. He was in Dallas the night before for a hastily convened meeting of a small group. That was the alleged reason he was there. It was at night, and he was staying at one of the key hotels where the Secret Service and other people were staying. And then we don't know his whereabouts the next morning, and we don't know his whereabouts until sometime in the afternoon after the assassination, where he pops up in another city. He's been flown there by private plane of a man I've learned had his own deep connections with intelligence. And then he shows up at this other place, and he makes a strange phone call to the FBI, and he calls them to sort of report something. And the report itself is so strange, you can only conclude that the call itself was some kind of an alibi call, that he wanted it in government records that he was in a place other than Dallas shortly after the assassination. And in Family of Secrets, I go into, in great detail, this phone call and how he makes a point of seeding it into the records. And I also go into how as I studied him, I realized what a devious person he was. From a very, very young age, he had been taught how to hide things, how to create alibis, how to create covering paper trails. And, of course, why not? I mean, that's what spies do. So he knew how to do this. That, I think, is what that was about. I also go into connections between George Bush and other people in the CIA, some of whom were in Dallas that day, who were not from Dallas, who were part of the CIA's covert operations, some of them part of the assassination and coup d'etat apparatus. I discovered that George Bush was and his wife had a lunch sometime around that week of the assassination in Texas with a man who ran CIA coups in other countries and who lived abroad and for some mysterious reason was visiting Dallas right in that period. So we have a lot there. Unfortunately, don't have the time here to go into all the details, but there's a lot of questions about what George H.W. Bush knew about the Kennedy assassination. And we also have, Ed, 2 documents that people can find online were released through the Freedom of Information Act, through the Kennedy Records Act, 2 FBI documents that mentioned George H.W. Bush from November 1963 in connection with the Kennedy assassination. They're very, very interesting. One is about his call to the FBI where he creates an alibi for himself. And the other is a memo saying that there was some kind of a briefing around the assassination right after, and that the person briefed for the CIA was George Bush. So fascinating, very, very important stuff. And, you can't really say that your country has any sort of democracy or effective ability to for the people to govern if we don't understand these kinds of huge traumas and deep mysteries that remain. And people will say, well, that's ancient history or something. It's not that ancient history. And of course, we know that the past is the predicate to the present, and we got here because of where we were before, and not understanding where we even came from we have no way to know how to go forward.
Did you look into any of the stuff like the arrest of Noriega, the destruction of the Medellin cartel, and the elevation of the Cali cartel under Bush?
It's not in the book, but I will tell you an odd thing about Medellin. Is this many years back? Let me see if I can tell this story straight. When there was a man who was a judge who helped Lyndon Johnson in his stealing of the 1948 Senate election, and that judge, Manuel Bravo of Zapata County, Texas. And by the way, Bush would later name his offshore oil company Zapata. That man was hired by Bush's so-called oil company with its CIA cover, and was installed in their office in Medellin, Colombia, a very strange location given it was an offshore drilling company, and Medellin is nowhere near the coast. So, I don't know, another weird mystery. I think it's somehow connected to Lyndon Johnson, the secret relationship between Lyndon Johnson and the Bushes, which I discovered was actually very, very close, even though people would say, well, they're from opposite parties, but they were actually very, very close, and that's important as well in understanding and knowing about Richard Nixon's shared grievances against John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy that the Bushes and Wall Street had. So I could tell you that, but no, I can't tell you much about the Medellin cartel.
Well, then what about this? Okay, fine. You've outlined what a dangerous, powerful group this was: Wall Street, big oil, military, CIA that had captured the White House under the Bush family. Are we lucky? When Clinton went in and replaced him, did all that just go away?
Well, it didn't. And what's interesting about Clinton, and one of the strangest things about him, is that he almost immediately, after beating George H.W. Bush, the two of them became fabulous friends. Fabulous friends. And nobody really ever understood this. The people say, oh, isn't that nice, bipartisan? You got to wonder if there wasn't something else going on. And, there was a lot of dirt, of course, on Bill Clinton. Some of it bubbles out a little bit here and there, the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, all the allegations against him over the years. I don't know what kind of an accommodation that was or how that worked, but they really called a truce. The Bushes never criticized Clinton or challenged him in any serious way. They remained such good friends. There's even a picture you could find online. Shortly before George H.W. Bush died, there's Bill Clinton hanging out with him, just like the closest of friends. It also was very interesting because of these drop-bys. Poppy Bush would just show up at the Clinton White House, just unexpected, just drop in to have a chat with Bill. So I can't tell you what that was about, but some people think it was unusual, to say the least.
Do you think perhaps they had mutual friends and interests in what was going on down there in Mena, Arkansas?
It's possible. I mean, there are indications that there was a CIA, and folks may have seen that movie about Mena, MENA, but there are indications that there was some kind of a CIA-sanctioned drug transshipment operation. There's no question that intelligence agencies engage in all kinds of what are normally illegal activities. They move weapons, they move gold, they move currency that isn't supposed to be moved. And historically, we know that during the Vietnam War, illegal drugs in the Golden Triangle, Southeast Asia, that these things were very important forms of currency to keep the wheels turning and to make payoffs and so forth. So, the MENA thing is very interesting and certainly worth a deep dig into the Clintons and the Bushes on that. There are many other connections as well. The company called Stevens Inc. was a giant investment banking firm out of Arkansas that funded Bill Clinton. They were also very, very close with Poppy Bush. So you see a lot of links. And then I think very importantly, Ed, Clinton, from the moment he came into office for the next 8 years, he never in any way challenged seriously the CIA, never challenged them. never looked into any of these things, although we are told that privately he suspected there was more to the Kennedy assassination story and was deeply interested. We also know that, I believe John Podesta, one of his key people, was deeply interested in that. So there was definitely an interest in the Kennedy assassination and a belief that the real story had not come out. But he didn't touch any of that. I think he was made to understand that some forces are too big to be challenged, that a president's power is actually extremely limited. The public is made to think that presidents are, kind of omnipotent, but they're not. And they've got to play ball with, absolutely, they cannot fall afoul of Wall Street. They can't fall afoul of the military. They can't fall afoul of this, huge, uncontrolled secret power that is the CIA, the NSA, military intelligence, and all those other many, many intelligence branches that exist within the government. It's really a danger to them, and they know that. And Bill Clinton was very, very cooperative in staying away from those things. Even his foreign policy was not really, that was supposed to be. You may remember the peace dividend that after the end of communism, the U.S. was supposed to change fundamentally. That we weren't going to need to have this huge military apparatus, these expenditures, the bases in whatever it was, 120 countries or something. All of this huge effort was supposed to be rolled back, and the money was supposed to be plowed into the United States to rebuild infrastructure and education and all these other things that we never saw happen. And I think Bill Clinton was that was his period, and he really didn't do much on that front. He did a lot of things, these things he called welfare reform and so on, which were actually or so-called penal reform, all of which was very much in sync with what the Republicans wanted. So, it's a mixed bag, and Democrats and Republicans are absolutely not the same. There's no question they're very, very different on many, many issues. Certainly their judicial appointments are quite different, and I think on some level, certainly their supporters' values are different. But when it comes to these kind of high-level things, I think accommodations absolutely are made.
Got about 4 minutes left, and I want to ask you, what is your assessment of Trump? He says he's an outsider, he's against the deep state, but he's involved in a lot of shenanigans, lifelong friends with Adnan Khashoggi, all kinds of stuff. What's your assessment? The outsider, what do you think?
He's basically just a criminal. He's a flim-flam man. Look, factually, he lies about almost everything with complete abandon. He doesn't even. He's actually at a point where he literally, if you watch a Republican convention, they could actually just, the sky could be blue and they just say, the sky's red, So, no, there's no point in even talking about this. The man just lies about everything. He's very, very dirty. He's very corrupt. He's very vicious. There is really almost nothing good you can say about the man, and yet the Republican Party got into this position where they're all hostage now, and they're all going to lose because, they've got a very uneducated populace. The people who vote for them are a huge chunk of America is extremely ignorant, and I'm not saying there are no basis for some of their concerns, but they react on an incredibly primitive level. They see people demonstrating who are a different color, and they need to take their guns out. They see everything as an imminent fear to their family. It's irrational. It's all stoked. It's a machine. Fox and these other things are all part of this. We've seen it in other countries. It's very,
Russ,
very dangerous.
I don't want to interrupt, but my question is, if the military and intelligence complex has been in control of the White House for so long, how did they let him in? How come they haven't removed him?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, and of course we don't know the answer.
Okay.
I think in part, probably some people that just, I think these agencies have changed somewhat, and I think they're gun shy, pardon the pun. I think they're much, much more careful, much more bureaucratic, much more, cover your behind. But I think also, to some extent, probably there are mixed feelings. I think there are probably some people in those places that like him.
Right.
They like what he says. I think there are a lot of people in the military who like him. I think there are probably a lot of people in the CIA who like him. And, I think that, and those who don't like him probably figure, listen, let him do the damage he's doing, and it'll get fixed later.
Russ, 1 minute. What do you want to leave us with?
Well, I just think we've got to have these kind of conversations, Ed. We've got to have media, and we've got to have journalists, and we've got to have authors who are willing to take risks and dig for answers without any preconceived notions. That's my mission. That's my goal. That's why I wrote Family of Secrets. That's why it's still selling, by the way, despite the blackout. It's a bestseller, and it's selling really, really well this many years after it first came out. And it's why I started Who, What, Why, which is a nonprofit investigative and analytical news site that's totally funded by the public. We always struggle to keep the doors open, lights on, but we do our work honestly, and we think it's what's got to be done. We all are in this together, and we got to be honest with each other.
Russ Baker, Family of Secrets, whowhatwhy.org. Russ, I can't thank you enough. This time just flew by. I really enjoy this. Anytime you ever want to come back and share your knowledge with us, may you have an open door to come back anytime.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you. Good night.